we learned something pretty extraordinary. One of the victims was a girl from Essex, but she'd been put into a children's home in Rotherham, and she was the only resident of that children's home. I'd never heard of solo care children's homes. In 2 months in that home, she'd gone missing 15 times, periods ranging from a day to a fortnight. And on one of those missing nights, she'd been taken to a house, put blind drunk in an upstairs bedroom, and cars had started arriving from all across Greater Manchester. Men were queuing on the stairs and on the landing outside the bedroom. And the jury heard that 50 men had had sex with that girl in one night. She was a child. When I looked into this children's home, it turned out that Rochdale had more than 40 solo care homes, each supposedly offering specialist 24/7 care to one child. Essex County Council was paying more than £250,000 a year to place that child there. We discovered a whole pattern of private care companies, many of them owned by private equity firms, buying very cheap properties in the north and the Midlands. And vulnerable kids were being shipped up from London and the southeast. Private companies were charging extortionate prices. And these kids were being placed, many of them right smack bang in the middle of sex grooming hotspots. That story is just one example of some of the spin-offs that came along the 4 years, but it led to an urgent government review, a significant shake-up of children's home regulations. By now, more and more criminal inquiries were being launched, but I kept coming back to Rotherham because something about what the police had done in that house really troubled me. We told and got to know some families so well in that town, and I got to know the case files, and it just seemed extraordinary that the authorities knew so much and did so little. I couldn't work out if it was just these isolated cases I was hearing about or whether it was something more. And eventually came the big breakthrough for the investigation, without question the most single important day, which was the day I drove to an address somewhere in South Yorkshire. I waited and eventually another car drove up. I opened my boot, the driver opened theirs, and 2 very large sagging cardboard boxes were transferred from their car to mine. Inside those boxes were hundreds of confidential documents: internal papers, police intelligence reports, social services case files. Those papers gave us the chance to tell a very detailed and damning story, how for more than a decade, South Yorkshire Police and Rotherham Council had known exactly what was happening. They knew the girls, they knew the names of the men, their nicknames, their home addresses, their car registration numbers, the places they were taking these children, and they had effectively sat back, shrugged their shoulders and done nothing. In my naivety, I thought that when we published that story in September 2012, those at the top of those 2 organisations would be so shocked and ashamed and horrified that they would immediately announce inquiries to try to get to the bottom of what had happened. Rotherham Council was indeed horrified, and an inquiry was launched, but not into their own failings. All they wanted to know was how we'd got hold of the documents. They'd already tried to get a High Court injunction to block an earlier story. Now they asked the police to launch a criminal inquiry into the leak. They also hired a firm of solicitors to investigate the security breach. As for the police, they not only dismissed all criticism, but publicly accused the Times of exploiting the victims. Those authorities were in complete denial, so we kept digging, and a year later, in August 2013, we published the story that eventually shamed the council into commissioning the independent inquiry, whose report was published in August last year. Rufus was telling you about it. It wasn't just the numbers 1,400 children. It was the clear evidence the inquiry had found of horrific crimes having been ignored or suppressed by the authorities. As Rufus said, suddenly Rotherham became headline news globally. China, Australia, Canada, you name it. And when I think back to what the editor said to me 4 years ago, we're going to keep on until, the council's chief executive told a parliamentary committee in evidence that the reason the council felt forced to commission that inquiry that ended up having such huge repercussions was because, quote, the Times wouldn't leave us alone. In the outcry that ensued, several senior people lost their jobs. Then the ruling Labour cabinet resigned en masse. Finally, the local authority was found not fit for purpose, and it's now run by a team of government-appointed commissioners. I think this story is an example of why newspapers matter. For years and years, people in that town had been desperately concerned by what was going on. They'd tried their very best to raise the alarm. Young girls and their families had pleaded with the police. Frontline workers told their bosses. Internal reports were written, seminars held, letters sent to chief constables, MPs, government departments, and absolutely nothing changed. And finally, when all else failed, someone very brave decided in desperation to place their trust in journalism. Those documents I was handed revealed something shameful, something people in power, people whose job it supposedly was to protect children, had chosen to keep safely hidden. It was, for obvious reasons, a very uncomfortable story to put on the front page of a national newspaper, but it was true. And sometimes it really is the uncomfortable truths that are the ones it's most important for journalists to tell, because if we don't, no one else will. On my own, I could have done exactly the same work as I've done these past 5 years, and it would have achieved precisely nothing. I could have posted blogs, I could have stood and shouted on street corners. It wouldn't have changed anything. But this wasn't me alone. This was the Times, which showed an extraordinary level of commitment and trust in allowing one of its staff reporters to pursue a single investigation for such a long time. And because it was the Times that kept running those stories, people listened. It wasn't the sort of story that immediately makes people rush out to buy newspapers. It exposed us, particularly in the early months, to some severe criticism, to accusations of racism. Our motivation was questioned, but we kept going. And we ended up giving a voice to some pretty invisible kids. And those articles have, I think, ended up changing the way this country responds to and tackles the sexual exploitation of children by groups of men. Some children, I hope, are safer as a result. That is journalism in the public interest. And to have had a chance to play a role in that process makes me a very lucky person. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.